Okay, I'm bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. I'm bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. Wait a minute, wrong platform. Sorry, this is AP Euro Review, Unit 2.1 to 2.3 that we'll be looking at today. Before we get into review, I want to show you a couple of things again, just to review from yesterday. So on my website in the 2020 AP Euro Review folder, I put a master list of SAQ, LEQ, and DDQ topics. If you want to access free response questions from the past, all you have to do is Google the year that you see there. So let's say we wanted to find AP Euro 2016 DBQ. We just type that in and it comes right up and you can access that particular test. So here would be one of the DBQs, one of the SAQs. This one is about railroads, which is about industrialization, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But anyway, that's one way that you can access them. I have also unlocked FRQs or SAQs on the AP Classroom website as well. So that is in the 2020 AP Euro Review folder or on the AP Classroom, depending on which one you want to do. Additionally, just based on student feedback, I have decided to stop putting up Google Docs of reviews. A couple of people have told me they don't even look at them or use them. They're taking their own notes as I go through the course description. So they are kind of time consuming. Unless there's a huge outcry for them, I'm going to discontinue them, but I will continue to put videos up. And again, if you look at the screen caps on these videos, it does look like I'm being tortured. So if anyone knows how to fix that, LMK. Okay, is there anything else I need to do? No. All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of this. So we're gonna move on to Unit 2. We had previously been on Unit 1. We just go over there, click Unit 2. And we'll be talking about a little bit of 2.1 and then mostly 2.2 and 2.3, which is entirely about the Protestant Reformation. All right, so the first part of 2.1 that we're going to look at is just these, let me see here, just these 3 points here for those of you who like to follow along in the course description. So basically, we got to explain the context in which the religious, political, and cultural developments of the 16th and 17th century took place. The key word there is explain the context. What was going on that led to that? So if we're going to start there, we should talk about what is going on before and then during the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, the big key concept that we're going to be talking about is religious pluralism will challenge the concept of a unified Europe. So let's start there. Prior to the 16th century, Europe was, for the most part, united under one Christian church, the Roman Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome. A common phrase for Europe was Christendom. Every major state was a Catholic state. There were some challenges to the Catholic Church. Of course, the humanists that we had talked about are going to criticize some of their practices and policies. But generally speaking, the Roman Catholic Church prior to Martin Luther is a monolith. It is a very powerful institution that controls all religious thought and practice and belief with very, very few exceptions. But then we are going to see that the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, otherwise known as the Catholic Reformation, are going to substantially change many, many things. We will see changes in theology, in religious institutions, in culture, and in attitudes about wealth and prosperity. And that's really what we're going to talk about today as we get into this course description. A classic College Board sort of thing, we are going to see that these religious reform movements, the Protestant Reformation and such, result in an increase in the state and kings, really, looking to control religious belief and practices within their own states. For example, Philip II, Ferdinand and Isabel, and then Philip II in Spain. We're going to see the Reconquista, which tries to kick out Jews and Muslims. We are also going to see the use of Inquisition to ferret out any people who are not Catholic. In France, we will see that the state is going to implement some pretty heavy-handed tactics against their Huguenot citizens. Perhaps the most famous of this is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where Catholic mobs go and kill very large numbers of Protestants. over a 2-week span, I want to say. And then another example of increasing state control, Henry VIII in England is going to launch the Reformation in England because he wants to get a divorce. And so it's more political, but he certainly is going to use the government to enforce this change in religion. However, and this is where we get to the classic College Board thing, although we are going to see states looking to increase religious control, we also see challengers to these attempts to increase state control. The best example of this is the Calvinists. If you remember what we talked about with the Calvinists, when they are in charge of a place, they implement really strict religious practices, no dancing, no fun, anything like that. But when they are religious minorities in states, they offer up fierce resistance as they look to practice their faith unencumbered from state control. The Puritans are a very good example of this in England. And so we will come back and talk about this topic a little bit more. And then last but not least, that 2.1 talks about is that there will be conflict between religious groups, Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, right? They're going to fight against each other. And oftentimes these conflicts overlapped with, in English, it overlapped with the political and economic competitions, both within a state and amongst states. So examples of this, Britain and Spain had a rivalry for control of colonies and trading routes and all these things. And then the Protestant Catholic rivalry is going to get swept up into that, as we see with the Spanish Armada, which is really launched because Elizabeth I refuses a marriage proposal from Philip II of Spain. And so he just wants to show her who's boss, I guess. Another example, and the best example of religious conflict that is going to involve multiple states, is the 30 Years' War, fought between German Protestants and Catholics, but then it's going to develop into a much larger international, not international, but multi-state sort of thing. Okay, so that's 2.1. So let's talk about 2.2. So 2.2 looks like this, titled Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Our big focus for these next two topics that we are going to talk about is explain how and why religious belief changed, right? This is going to be the key focus of what we talk about today, how and why religious belief and practices changed between 1450 and 1648. All right, so Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther was a member of the Catholic Church in the German states, otherwise known as the Holy Roman Empire. And he is going to be the most important Protestant reformer prior to 1555. 1555 is one of those dates that you should know. That is when, after decades of conflict, the Peace of Augsburg is ratified, for lack of a better term, and Lutherans get legal protection to practice their religion, sort of, kind of, in the Holy Roman Empire. The main idea of the Peace of Augsburg is that the prince of each state, and there are over 300 German states at this time, gets to choose the religion that's practiced. And so if you live in the lands of a Protestant prince, you're practicing Lutheranism. Peace of Augsburg only applied to Lutherans, didn't apply to Calvinists, though, and so we're going to see further conflict in the Holy Roman States. But anyway, the main ideas that Luther is going to put forth is he's going to criticize many things of the Catholic Church. The first one that he is going to talk about is sola fide, or salvation by faith alone, which you can see over on the left-hand side, is one of the illustrative examples. Basically, what Luther is going to say is that God rewards people who have true faith in Jesus, and they get to go to heaven. That there's no amount of good deeds that a person can do because humans are so wicked, and because God is not just a bean counter. There's nothing that we can do to ensure our salvation. Now, this counters Catholic teachings. The Catholic Church is going to teach that you must do good works in addition to having faith. And the major good works the church wants you to do is to participate in the sacraments, 7 religious rituals that you can do to win God's favor. And of course, the only way you can receive these sacraments is through official representatives of the church, otherwise known as priests, right? And that leads us to the second thing that Luther is going to attack. Luther is going to say that the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church is all a bunch of nonsense, right? You have popes, you have cardinals, bishops, and then priests at the lowest levels. And basically, there is a line that separates the clergy from the laity. Catholic priests are going to take vows of celibacy, and they are going to be separated from the people that they teach. The Pope is also going to claim to have tremendous powers to make religious rules. And the Pope is going to hold himself up as a co-authority when it comes to Scripture. So basically, Luther is going to say, yeah, no, that's not it. The Bible is the only source of authority that a person needs, and that's over here where it says primacy of Scripture. Right? Luther is going to teach that, you know, you should just read the Bible, that you don't need the Pope or church teachings. And in fact, church teachings based on things that aren't in the Bible don't really stand up to religious scrutiny. For example, the sacraments we talked about earlier. There are only 2 mentioned in the Bible, so guess what Luther's going to say? Those are the only 2 valid ones. The other ones are just made up by the Catholic Church. All right, and then the last thing that Luther is going to talk about is this priesthood of all believers. He's going to remove the specialness of the Catholic priests, and basically he's going to say that, you know, anyone can kind of be a preacher. You don't need to have like special approval from the Pope or something like that. And so Lutheran reverends or pastors or whatever you want to call them are going to marry and have families. They're going to live their lives like normal people. They're not going to act differently or have different rules that regulate their behavior compared to the rest of the clergy. This is a big difference from the Catholic Church. Okay, so Luther goes and does that. He says all these things. We are going to talk about the printing press and how he gets his message out, and he gains lots of followers in the Holy Roman Empire, in the German states. He is also going to inspire actions elsewhere. Other Reformation leaders are going to emerge. The second most important one, and the most important after 1555, is John Calvin. Now, John Calvin is going to set up shop in Geneva, Switzerland. Geneva? Zurich. I think it's Geneva, in Switzerland. No, it is Geneva. Geneva, Switzerland. But he comes by way of France. He's actually a French Huguenot who was kicked out of France because of his religious beliefs. The Catholic monarchy there does not tolerate religious pluralism. And so he sets up shop in Geneva. He is going to become the leading figure of the Reformation post-1555. And when we talk about the Reformation in the Western states, like France, the Low Countries, England, he's the most influential figure because his ideas are going to shape the Protestant groups that form there. So Calvin's big idea, is the idea of predestination, that God has already determined who is saved and who is not. And so there is absolutely nothing a person can do to ensure their salvation. Again, it's only going to be based upon faith. Now, God has chosen those who are saved. They are known as the elect. And the elect can show that they are saved by living the most godly life possible, right? Calvin is going to teach, if you really think that you are one of the ones that God has saved, your behavior will be impeccable and you will be a shining light to the rest of the world. And so Calvin is going to not just talk the talk of saying, you know, salvation by faith alone. He's going to say, well, you better live your life in the most pious way possible. And so that is going to make, you know, Calvinist societies pretty strict and pretty austere, as they are going to really try to avoid sinful activities or topics. But another thing that Calvin is going to introduce is, you know, the Catholic Church had a conflicted relationship with business and profiteering and money making. But Calvin is basically going to say, if you are successful, that is a sign of God's favor, right? That wealth and prosperity on earth is a good sort of notion. It's not a sign of sinfulness. It's a sign of God's favor. And so many people like to connect Calvin to the idea of like early capitalism that we also know is beginning to emerge within European society at this time. The state of Texas in particular. Okay. 2 guys who are not mentioned in the course description, but I thought they would be useful to mention here. Ulrich Zwingli is another Swiss reformer. He's actually going to die in battle against Catholic armies in Switzerland, but he was very big on the primacy of Scripture. He would only practice things that were stated explicitly in the Bible. And then, of course, Henry VIII. And we talked about him in the last review section about how monarchs were increasing their power, but Henry is going to be a leading figure of the Reformation. His movement is more about the political necessity of his reign than it is about devout religious belief, because he's really a pretty solid Catholic. And even after the Reformation takes place, the Anglican Church in England is going to retain many Catholic features, much to the consternation of the Calvinist Puritans inside of England. That is foreshadowing some conflict that we will talk about later. Okay, let's go with, now we can go back to full screen. The last group of people we need to talk about for 2.1 are the radical groups that emerged from the Reformation as well. Luther basically says, and so does Calvin, that you can read the Bible for yourself and draw your own conclusions and figure out what God's word is. And so many people are going to take him up on that sort of invitation. And so we are going to see the emergence of more radical groups. The Anabaptists are a famous example of this. The Anabaptists are all characterized by their support for adult baptism, that a person has to willingly and knowingly choose to become a follower of Jesus Christ, that you can't just have it given to you at birth like the Catholics did, like Lutherans and others would. But it's their other beliefs that are going to get them into trouble and make them fall into this radical group. And there's two ways in which they are really radical. Number one, they're going to refuse to let the state subjugate their religious practices. Right? They are going to refuse to let the state control what they see as their rights to free worship. And so oftentimes they might refuse to pay taxes, or they would refuse to serve in the military. Many of these Anabaptist groups will be pacifists. The Quakers are an example of that. And so they are going to form their own little communities where they will practice their religious beliefs. But of course, these are now pockets of resistance to monarchical control inside of society. So they're going to be pretty unpopular with many of the powers that be. And so Anabaptists are going to find that they are going to be quite persecuted. Another thing that the Anabaptists are going to do sometimes is they are going to practice certain sexual mores that freak out the squares, if you will. Polygamy is not an unusual feature in some of these early Anabaptist communities. They're going to justify this based on passages from the Old Testament. Solomon had like 500 wives or something. And so they're going to practice that. It's going to freak out all the squares. And of course, that's going to result in persecution as well. Last but not least, we have the German peasants. The German peasants in the German states are going to follow Luther's lead. They're going to read the Bible for themselves. But they are going to be influenced by lay preachers, which is really just like randos who grab the Bible and start preaching, like Thomas Müntzer. And Thomas Müntzer is going to really latch on to the idea of Christian equality, a brotherhood in Christianity where God creates all people equal. And so if God has created everyone equally, why don't we see that equality on earth? And so the German peasants are going to begin to rebel. They're going to seize church lands, Roman Catholic church lands, monasteries, and things like that. But they'll also begin to attack the land of nobles and seizing that property as well. This represents a massive challenge to the state, obviously, and Luther is not cool with this at all. He is going to condemn the peasant rebellions, and he's going to side with the forces of authority that crush them. Hundreds of thousands of peasants will die in the fighting, and it just shows that the Protestant leaders often sought to use the state to enforce their reforms. They were not looking for complete religious freedom or social revolution, right? They were just not about political and social revolution. Okay, that is it for 2.2. Now we're going to move on to 2.3. 2.3 is more Protestant Reformation stuff, and our big focus remains the same. We want to explain how and why religious belief changed. There's really not much in 2.3 that we haven't already talked about, so we're winding this down here. One thing you should know, just like in the Renaissance, the printing press is going to play a role in the Protestant Reformation. People like Luther are going to use the ability to mass produce their ideas to use literature to spread his ideas far and wide. Luther's 95 Theses, which are criticisms of the church that start off the whole the whole shebang, are going to be taken down and printed. We are going to see that printers are very supportive of the Protestant Reformation because it helps them gain wealth and money. And Luther is going to write far and wide talking about why the Catholic Church is bad, why he's right, why you should follow his ideas. Another way we see the printing press play a role in the Protestant Reformation is the translation of the Bible into the vernacular languages that are spoken, right? One of the Protestants' main ideas is read the Bible for yourself. You don't need that church hierarchy, the clergy, to tell you what to do. God's rules are spelled out in the Bible. So read it yourself. Well, the Bible under the Catholic Church was only allowed to be published in Latin, a language that most people didn't read. And so one of the first things Luther does when he's in hiding after the church has declared him an outlaw is translate the Bible into German. So we're going to see German and French and Spanish and English Bibles that is going to allow for Protestantism to spread. Number two, and we've already talked about this, although monarchs are going to want to enforce religious uniformity within their societies, and many will successfully. Spain is going to have very little impact from the Protestant Reformation. It's going to have very little impact on their society. Henry VIII is going to successfully move England from a Catholic country to the Anglican Church, a Protestant country. So while we do see some monarchs using state control to control religious belief, we will see characters and actors outside of the state seek to resist that state control. Calvin is a good example of this. Calvinists, like the Puritans in England, are going to often oppose the policies of the monarch because they don't like his religious policies. This is going to lead to the English Civil War eventually. We will also see the Anabaptists challenge the role of the church in determining what religious practices are acceptable and things like that. Last but not least, the last thing we'll talk about for today is the religious conflict that happens during this time is often going to be done, and it's going to challenge the monarchy's power. There are three good examples of this that we will look at. Number one, the Puritans in England are going to feel that the Anglican Church created by Henry VIII is too Catholic, that it has not pushed forward far enough, which makes complete sense because Henry VIII was a dutiful Catholic. And he didn't really want to do the Reformation, but political necessity made that happen. And so we are going to see that the Puritans are going to be critical of the Anglican Church, and eventually the Puritans are going to oppose the Stuart Kings. Charles I in particular will be very contentious. His relationship will be very contentious with the Puritans. It will result in the English Civil War, and eventually, for a time, we will see the abolition of monarchy, parliament, and the Anglican Church under Oliver Cromwell in England. Eventually, they'll bring things back, and we'll start to see England emerge as the limited constitutional monarchy with relative religious toleration, unless you're Catholic or Jewish, in that state moving forward. So the Protestant Reformation is going to help England emerge into what they are today. Number two, the French Huguenots are going to often resist the Catholic monarchy of France. Many civil wars are going to break out. A time of fearful disorders is what Henry IV, he is the king who issues the Edict of Nantes, which tries to create some religious protection for the Huguenots inside of France. But this is another example. France is torn asunder by these religiously fueled wars inside of it in the 1500s. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre is a great example of that again. And then that leads to the issuing of the Edict of Nantes, where Henry IV, or Henry of Navarre, tries to create religious tolerance, but this will be quickly revoked by Louis XIV. And so Huguenots are going to find themselves treated as second-class citizens inside of France. And then number three, another way that religious conflict challenged monarchy would be the Lutherans versus the Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War. It starts out as a battle between Lutherans and Catholics inside the German states that the Holy Roman Emperor is in charge of. And we're going to see all sorts of conflict here, as this is the ground zero of the Reformation. The Peace of Augsburg had dealt with earlier conflict It tried to create a situation where Protestants and Catholics could sort of coexist, although they weren't living in the same state. But eventually the 30 Years' War breaks out. And we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, but this is another example of challenging the power of the Holy Roman Emperor inside the German states. Okay, that's it for today. If you got any questions, or if you want me to read any of your SAQs or LEQs or DDQs, if you want to focus on that, because that's probably what the test is going to be like this year, as opposed to multiple choice stuff, feel free to email me. We will talk again tomorrow about 2.4 through 2.5. I think it's about the religious conflict some more. But until then, I'll talk to you guys later.